I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much. You were the only ethics professor I've ever had that made the topic super, super interesting. I mean, seriously, it just resonated. Even the folks in the cohort talk about it still, and it was just such a topic that I think kind of gets beat up a little bit, and it's kind of like table stakes. But you made it so interesting and made it so reflective, and it's still resonating with me. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're up to today?
Oh, what I'm working on today?
Yeah.
Well, I've started on a new book. I'm interested in why in modern times we tend to talk a lot about ethical dilemmas.
Yeah.
Because in fact, I would say that in ancient times, at least in ancient times from what we know about the time through texts, there was not much interest in ethical dilemmas. Ethical dilemmas are not at the center of Socratic thinking, Aristotle, Epictetus, the Stoics, Confucianism. And I'm interested in how we got to a place where people think that every ethical issue is an ethical dilemma.
Okay.
And I don't think it is. So I'm trying to unpack historically where I would say we went off the rails.
And when you say ethical dilemma for the non-academics listening, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that's an open question.
Oh, okay.
Frequently, an ethical dilemma is equated with a hard choice, but I would say hard choices aren't ethical dilemmas.
Yeah.
That just means it's a difficult choice, and we all have difficult choices. So an ethical dilemma usually means that you're facing a situation where you're caught between two conflicting duties or two conflicting principles or two conflicting calculations, and they both are quite compelling. So you're sort of suspended and unable to make a decision. And I think that most of our life is not like that. If that happens at all, it's a very rare case.
Yeah,
and
thankfully.
Thankfully, right.
Yeah.
But the problem about talking about ethical dilemmas all the time is we move our focus from things that do happen and do concern us. And most of those have to do with discernment of what the right thing to do is in the here and now.
Yeah.
And it's about who should change the cat litter, me or my husband, who babysits for the kids, and those are issues of justice and kindness and friendship.
But they're not ethical dilemmas.
They're not ethical dilemmas, exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the problems is that ethical dilemmas, I think if they occur at all, are very rare. Or alternatively, if all you mean by an ethical dilemma is that they're trade-offs, then just about every choice in the public realm is an ethical dilemma, right? So if the city of Chicago spends money on sidewalks, it's not spending money on after-school programs for kids. So then I'd say if an ethical dilemma just involves a trade-off, then you've evacuated it of all meaning because every decision is an ethical dilemma. So I think we need to be really clear about what these ethical dilemmas supposedly are and how often they occur.
Sure. So do you want to talk through some of the ones that you've proposed, like in class that we talked through, or do you have a good example, say in business, of an ethical dilemma?
I think we could go through some in the class, but maybe we want to come at that a little bit more obliquely a little bit later. And I guess what I'd say are all of those are opportunities for discernment, but I wouldn't say they're ethical dilemmas, and I never called them such. I just sort of said, here's the situation, and what do we do here?
Yeah, so what is a good example then if you think of like in business? Is it, Enron type situations? What are the ethical dilemmas that come to mind?
I don't think I can really think of a single ethical dilemma in business. I can think of situations where people were asked to make a right choice and maybe didn't. So I think in the case of Enron, you have a lot of issues there involving people's motivations and how people thought of themselves and how people responded to pressures that were created in the culture at Enron. And the ethical issues tend to be what were ethics in what were Enron's incentive systems?
Yeah.
What kind of leadership was modeled and exemplified by people at the top?
Sure.
What kind of resistances did people put up and why or why not? Why did people never stop and say, oh, I'm not going along with this? Yeah. Those are questions of discernment and questions maybe of virtue or vice.
Yeah.
But they're not really dilemmas.
Yeah, because they were, at the end of the day, all unethical.
Yeah, they were.
All the decisions made were.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so you talked a lot about Milton Friedman. And actually, I was just listening on a book on the way here, a Simon Sinek book, and he's talking about Milton Friedman. I'm like, wow, how serendipitous that on the way there. So I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't talk about that a little bit. And you mentioned it even with Enron, like what are the incentives? And Milton Friedman, business economist, said that the purpose of business is to generate a profit, and that you're
To maximize.
Oh,
maximize.
okay, yeah.
Maximize legal profits.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So go ahead. Say a little bit more about that and his place on it. And this is from like 70s ish.
Yeah, right.
Is
So
that-
Milton Friedman wrote a famous article for the New York Times. I think it was in 1973 or 1977. I'm not remembering the exact date. But he was basically a libertarian economist and argued that the only social responsibility of business was to maximize legal profits.
Yeah.
So he was basically responding to people who were advocating for what we now would call stakeholder capitalism,
Yeah.
or the idea that you have a variety of responsibilities. And he was claiming that the only responsibility was to maximize profits. And he gives a variety of arguments for that. But you could hypothesize that there could be dangers, ethical dangers in that position.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think Enron, keep going back to that, is a good example because they felt they were delivering to their shareholders.
Right.
Yeah. And then their actions, obviously, they're not doing the right thing. So decades now later, that thinking has evolved, obviously, to some degree. But I think there's still businesses that hold that belief that the bottom line is the most important. But that's when they run into danger.
Right. I think you could run into danger on the stakeholder side too. I mean, I
Sure.
don't think there's a completely safe stance.
No, right.
But there has been some interesting research done by business ethicists who've looked at mission statements, and they've tried to compare stakeholder versus stockholder focused firms.
Oh, interesting.
And there's some evidence that stockholder focused firms may be more likely to get into ethical difficulty. Although again, you have to be careful how you measure that. I tend to be in favor of really concrete measured events that you can associate with deviance. So, for example, restating your earnings due to fraud.
Sure.
That's a pretty clear case of wrongdoing.
Yeah.
If the researchers just sort of saying, well, I think the company did something wrong in developing this product. You know, one person's hideous product is another person's salvation.
Right,
so
right.
those cases can be kind of trickier. But you can hypothesize that companies that are only wanting to maximize shareholder value might get into trouble because they just behave in a mechanical way. They sort of say, oh, we don't have to think about this. It's going to make a lot of money. Ergo, we can do it, and we know we'll be on the right side of things.
Right.
Also, sometimes shareholders want companies to do things in the short run that will generate short-run profits, but may not be good for the long-run health of the company.
Yeah.
So even then, you'd have to ask Milton Friedman, well, what revenues or profits are we talking about, short-term or long-term? And he's noticeably silent on that topic. So you know what I'm saying is even from the stockholder perspective, you could still have problems if you're too narrowly focused on this quarter's earnings. And if they're all that pressure, then you get people playing a lot of games, you know, where they're moving revenue recognition around just to look like they've maximized revenue for that quarter.
So what would you say to an entrepreneur starting out? I mean, what's the right approach to take to that? And obviously you have to generate revenue to keep the company afloat, but do you have any advice for entrepreneurs that are thinking about starting a company and like what the ethos of the company should be centered around ethics or purpose or?
Yeah, that's a great question, Karen. I think one, the company should, if it hasn't incorporated yet, it really needs to think about its incorporation. Does it want to incorporate as an S Corp or one of the new benefit corporations?
Yeah.
So there's something to think about there. I don't give any advice. I think that any kind of corporate form could work, but there are different pressures depending upon how you incorporate. Because if you're a benefit corporation, what you need to produce is the benefit report every year, or biannually. It varies from state to state what the law requirement is. But then you're on the hook for showing that you have provided the benefit that you've committed to providing. I guess what I would say to an entrepreneur is your focus shouldn't be on how are we going to build the company and get out of here, in 5 years.
Yeah.
I think entrepreneurs who are thinking a lot about their exit plan are not thinking enough about what's going on in the here and now, and that's the danger. I think also they should think about what product or service are they developing where they have a good that's really good and a service that really serves. And if they are providing good goods and really beneficial
solving
services, solving a problem,
making society better, hopefully.
Yeah. I think they're less likely to go astray, and frankly, they're more likely to inspire Gen X and millennial workers. We have a lot of data on that. I'm sure you've probably spoken with people in the past who are much more knowledgeable about that than I am. But a lot of the data suggests that people, younger employees, are more interested in working for a company where they can see a tangible benefit back to a very specific community.
Yeah, absolutely. They're definitely looking for purpose, and even when it comes to like clothing, sustainability.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and B Corps. They'll
Right.
seek out a B Corp and even pay more for the goods
Right.
if they have that other higher purpose.
Well, I don't know if you saw that Eileen Fisher and Nordstrom now are both going to start selling used clothing. Eileen Fisher will take back in used clothing and resell it.
I
And
did
even
not
if
see that.
Even if it's damaged, they now will repurpose. Upcycle some of it. Yeah, repurpose some of it. So that's interesting. And I haven't verified the claim about Nordstrom's, but a colleague just told me that she had read that Nordstrom's is going to start selling used clothing. And so,
well, that's interesting. There's a professor at DePaul that came and talked to our DBA cohort, and he talked about the donation pollution, and that clothing is one of the biggest sources of that, which you don't think about. You're donating your clothes and then it becomes in a landfill somewhere. So that's fascinating that they're taking that approach. I think there is a big opportunity for that for sure.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to really think the whole stream because actually my husband and I were just talking today about rags.
Yeah.
And, the rag industry is a really important way that cotton gets recycled. But the more clothing has synthetic materials, the less it can go into the rag stream.
Okay.
So then you have a problem about landfill, or you have a problem where churches and other groups send a lot of clothing over, let's say to Africa, and then basically you displace the local entrepreneurs in those countries. So there's been some studies done on kente cloth manufacturing in Kenya, where the local beautiful cloth has now been largely displaced because the market has just been flooded with Western cast-offs.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's not exactly pollution. It's more like, colonization or clothing colonization or something.
And you also have to think about the ripple effect. You think you're doing good, but what's the long-term effect? So let's hear a little bit about you, though. So what is your background? Because I don't know that much about you other than, where you are today. But, where did you go for your undergrad, and then what happened after that?
Oh, okay.
I love to hear origin stories.
Okay. Well, I came from Kansas to the University of Chicago.
Okay.
Back when the college was very small at the University of Chicago. There were a lot of graduate students, but the college was rather small and intimate. I had a great time. I had wonderful professors and a really rigorous and challenging education there. And then I was fortunate to have been encouraged by a female dean to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship. So it was the first year that women were eligible for the Rhodes.
Oh my gosh.
And somebody, fortunately, was monitoring that. And the dean reached out to a bunch of women with a letter and sort of said, hey, do you know this? And I hadn't even heard that the will had been broken and that now women were able to apply. And so I applied, and I was really lucky to be in that first cohort of women Rhodes Scholars. So out of the 32, I think there were 13 of us, or 12. I can't remember. The newspapers had trouble because my name, Daryl, is oftentimes a man's name, and they couldn't figure out if I was a man or a woman, so there was a lot of confusion in the reporting. So then I went to Oxford for 3 years, and I got a second BA in a program called Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. And I had, by that time, already done a lot of work in political theory and ethics, but I knew that I wanted to learn something about economics because I could tell that a lot of discourse was now increasingly dominated by economics in the United States and elsewhere. So I did that degree. I completed it. A lot of American roads do not actually, they take the money and then they don't take the exam over there.
Okay.
So I was happy to actually, go through the whole program and sit the exam.
Wait, I don't want to gloss over the fact that you're the first cohort of women to do the Rhodes Scholar. And so for folks that aren't familiar with that, can you say a little bit more about what it is? And
yeah, the Rhodes Scholarship was founded by Cecil Rhodes, a British colonial, British colonist, I guess you would say, who founded Rhodesia, what was then called Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe. And he set a fund for educating the next generation of leaders. And the idea would be that young men should go to Oxford and get grounded in important ways of thinking so that they could become better leaders for the future. So for generations, men had that scholarship. Some men from America, I think it was open to some of the colonies early on, Canada and Australia too, maybe. I'm not quite sure about the history there. But there was no mention of women, of course. A women's place was in the home then.
Oh my gosh.
And so the will was contested. I think in the late 60s or early 70s, it took a while for the court case to work its way through the court system. And then in 1977, the announcement was made by the Rhodes Foundation that women would now be eligible. And the scholarship brings people over for 2 years, possibly a third year. and you either do a BA degree or you do something called an MPhil, which is a 2-year graduate degree, or a DPhil, which is a PhD program. But you have to be accepted by a college there. So you have to apply on your own to college to make sure that you'll be accepted, because Oxford reserves the right to say, even though you have a Rhodes Scholarship, we're still not going to take you. Yeah.
The selective of the selective.
Yeah. Well, I guess, the colleges are not that large in the scheme of things, and they have a pretty limited faculty. So if you said, I want to study law at College X, and X doesn't have any law faculty, you could see how that could be a problem from the point of view of the college. So anyway, I got that scholarship, did the degree, made a lot of great friends, and then I came back because I decided I wanted to work on ethics. So I came back and I went into the University of Chicago's PhD program, the Committee on Social Thought. Again, had some great professors there. And I was due to sit my exams around 1982, 83, which I did. But that was a very bad time. People don't remember that we had quite a severe recession in that period. Also, so Hannah Gray, who was then the university's president, said it was the single worst year in the University of Chicago's history for placing people. So it was really a serious problem. I thought, I have to have a backup. I can't come out of the program applying for jobs and then, be someplace rural where my husband couldn't get a job. Or I needed to have some options. So I had a detour into a program at First Chicago, which is now J.P. Morgan. It was called the First Scholar Program. And basically, if you could be accepted into an MBA program at University of Chicago or at Northwestern, the bank would pay for that MBA program, and you would do rotations through different areas of the bank, the trading floor, the lending area,
That's cool. Yeah.
Retail banking, high net worth banking, et cetera. So I went into that program, had some great mentors. I had some wonderful female bosses there. And I did that for 5 years. And at that point, the economy was looking up again. And I thought, well, I'd like to finish the PhD, and now I should do it. And if I can get a job, that's great. And if not, I have another career path here in banking. So I went back to the University of Chicago, and as luck would have it, this is where serendipity always plays a role. People think they're planning. It makes people make all kinds of plans and don't realize the extent to which sometimes it's just being in the right place at the right time. So when I came back to the university, it was a time when applied ethics was the fastest growth area in philosophy. So if you wanted to get a job, you were far more likely to get a philosophy job in a professional school or in a philosophy department if you could do some applied ethics. Well, I had an MBA in finance. I had 5 years of bank work experience, and I had a PhD in ethics. So then I applied to DePaul University, where I got my first job, and started working at the university. And loved teaching. I've never had any regrets about making the move into teaching.
Yeah, same. I really like it. Yeah. It's weird. I just never thought of academia as a career path until later in life. So I'm still figuring out what it is I want to do. But I didn't consider it. I wish I had, because I do enjoy it as well. And I also enjoy studying a topic really deeply. I don't know. There's something about that I really enjoy. So obviously,
now you know.
Yeah,
now you know.
Yeah. So I'll be an astronaut in 5 years. Who knows? So at DePaul, you're the Wicklander Chair. Am I saying that right? Okay. So what is that?
The Wicklander Chair here doesn't mean that you're the chairman or chairwoman of the department. It means that you have a full professorship that comes with some endowment. So Callista Wicklander and the Wicklander family had a great interest in ethics. They've been tremendous supporters of DePaul, and particularly ethics programs and programming that explores ethical issues. So this is an endowed chair. My predecessor, Pat Warehane, who's a great business ethicist, sort of the mother of business ethics in the United States, had the chair at DePaul before me. And when she retired, I applied for the position and got it. So basically means I teach, but I also have some time to do some research. And I also then direct the Institute for Business and Professional Ethics. I'm the managing director there. So we do programming. We just did a fantastic program on the ethical issues associated with the expungement of criminal records for people who are in prison or have a prison record because of selling marijuana. And now, of course, people are in prison who sold marijuana in smaller amounts that it's now legal to.
Yeah.
So I know as a former policewoman, you probably have some thoughts on that, but there are all kinds of issues of justice.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you come to any sort of outcome on that or decision or
Well,
stance?
we had Kim Fox and some of her female colleagues who had worked on the legalization of marijuana law and the expungement. And I think what I learned is that it's it's important, I think, to have the law, but it's also important to implement it as quickly as you can. And there are all kinds of challenges because although you can say the records are expunged, somebody has to manually go and get paper files out, and those have got to be processed and then shredded and so forth. Everything is not done via the computer. I guess I was sort of naive. I thought,
there's one click of a button and no.
and a lot of city and county buildings still have very dated technology.
Yeah.
So apparently, if I understood Ms. Fox correctly, they can quickly pull up who's eligible for expungement.
Sure.
People who aren't in for something else, or people who didn't have too large a quantity. I forget what the cutoff is, but it's sort of small amount we're legally allowed to possess. But then actually making sure that the files are retrieved. And in some cases, they need to send expungement letters to people so they know. But the last known address might be from 1970, 1978. So how do you even get hold of people?
Gosh, I didn't even think about that when cannabis was legalized. I unfortunately did lock up a lot of people for cannabis. I mean, it was very prevalent, and it, of course, was illegal at the time that I was a police. And so, didn't even think about that when it comes to it.
And another ethical issue right now is how do you get the word out? Because, if you're on the DePaul campus, since we take federal money, it's not legal to be smoking marijuana on campus.
I think
it's not legal in the
gray,
banks,
fuzzy,
in the CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority. Those are not legal. So I think people hear, oh, cannabis is legalized, and they think I can smoke wherever. But no, you can't smoke on the train. You can't smoke on the L platform. There are still places where you could get arrested.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah. So you teach classes as well. So do you teach undergrads, grads?
Oh, I teach your way. I'm graduate students in the philosophy department.
Awesome.
I taught graduate students in the DBA program.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, you were one in that cohort. And then I teach undergrads as well.
Okay. And there are students from all different disciplines or business or?
Yeah, there are students from business. At the undergraduate population, there's obviously a wide array, math students, music students, digital media students.
Yeah.
The DBA program had people who came from a variety of industries, or different stages in their career. The graduate philosophy students are maybe a little bit less diverse group. So those are all people who are obviously they're graduate students largely in the philosophy department. I've occasionally had someone who is from another department. You might get a graduate philosophy student or a graduate psychology student or something like that. But since DePaul doesn't have very many graduate programs, the majority of those PhD students are just from philosophy.
And why is it important to study ethics, even at the undergraduate, no matter what the discipline is?
That's a really great question. I think it's because I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, I don't really buy the claim that you can't teach anybody ethics. It's of course true that people do have habits, and at a certain point, if someone's a confirmed serial killer, the person is less likely to be interested in ethics. But most people are still teachable, I think. And I also think that these kinds of books, like I learned everything I needed to know about ethics when I was in kindergarten, are really kind of silly because you don't really understand what sexual harassment is, what it means, how it arises. You don't know what a conflict of interest is. Trust me, even business people don't know what a conflict of interest is. So it's important just to get some conceptual apparatus and clarification on terms so that one can think clearly about what something is. That's one reason you study ethics. I also think you study ethics because you want to know how the individual organizational culture and the larger culture interact because really, we have a series of interlocking spheres here. None of them are completely discrete. You are what you are today in part because of your family, for example.
Yeah.
And same for me. So I think one thing a good business ethics class can do is begin to get people thinking about the interrelation of those things. And that's important because I always tell my students, think long and hard about where you're going to work because you're going to spend a lot of your working life
absolutely.
In your awake hours in the corporation. More
like 2/3.
2/3, right. More of your time there than you're going to spend with your loved ones, probably. And so you need to think about what kind of helpful or toxic environment you're getting into. And I'm somewhat heartened that a lot of Gen X and millennials are apparently more willing to ask questions during the interview process about the culture. And you can see even now people speaking up at Google and at Amazon and so forth about the company's policies. And I'm somewhat heartened by that.
Yeah, that's good. So that was going to be my next question, is how can people kind of ferret out what the environment is beforehand?
Oh, I think you could certainly look at the language on the website, and you can look at the mission statement, for example, and then just go into the Wall Street Journal for the last 3 years and look at, if you're applying to Company X, read Company X's mission statement, and then look at the news about Company X and just ask yourself, is there consistency here, or do we have a kind of incoherency?
Yeah.
And if you have discord, then I think that tells you something. It tells you probably that the mission statement is not controlling, that there are other kinds of informal norms, such as do what it takes to hit the numbers or something like that, that are at work here.
Yeah.
I think you can talk to adults. If you have a college alumni office, and if they have a list of who works at a company that you're thinking about applying to, oftentimes alums are happy to have lunch with young students. I would say call up the person, say, hey, I'm thinking about maybe looking to work at so-and-so in downtown Chicago. I see you work there.
Yeah.
Maybe you could meet me for lunch and give me
I
some
always
of your
leverage
insights.
the DePaul connection. It's
right.
like a fellow Prius driver. Like, hey, I went to DePaul, and and people are usually more than willing to help. I think that's actually a really good tip.
Yeah. So, and that's a way to get an insider's point of view. I would read like the reviews on
Glassdoor,
Glassdoor and so forth. And you have to be aware that there's a negative bias usually on Yelp and these
somebody's
sites.
left and they're angry.
But oftentimes I think you get something that sounds rather balanced there. So you can certainly do that. And then I think also just be alert for cultural codes, even when you're interviewing there.
Yeah.
How do people dress? Do people interact? Or is everybody locked away in an office? If the HR people interview you, you could ask them. They may not tell you, but you could always ask, what does the HR company think the largest ethical challenges are at the firm? And they're probably not going to say, Karen or Daryl did X, Y, and Z, but you might get, some data points that you could use in making a decision.
Yeah. Okay. And, a lot of times the culture does dictate how decisions are made and the things that they let slide and all of that. And so one of the things that you talked about in the DBA cohort was, am I going to say this right? Nicomachean ethics?
Nicomachean.
Nicomachean. I knew I didn't have that right.
Close.
Nicomachean, Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. And it seriously, I went home and read the scenarios to my husband because they were so compelling. But you talked about Aristotle's position on voluntary versus involuntary actions. And that, I don't know, it just makes it so kind of clear on your culpability, I guess, in decisions that you make and the outcomes that happen. So can you say a little bit more about that more eloquently than I did?
So Aristotle's largest treatise on ethics is called the Nicomachean Ethics, and he has a extended discussion of when is an action voluntary or involuntary. And I think he spends a lot of time on this distinction because, as he says, when we do something that's good, we like to be praised. And so we'll say, our action was voluntary. If we do something that's unjust or unkind, we'll oftentimes blame circumstances or say our action is involuntary. So there's kind of an asymmetry here in temptation.
Yeah.
And I think he wants to enable us to hold ourselves responsible and to enable others to hold us accountable by distinguishing voluntary versus involuntary action. So when is an action voluntary? He says an action is voluntary whenever the moving principle is within you. And he uses a Greek word, the arche is within you. But that just means whenever you originate the action or contribute anything to the action. So for example, if I'm held up at gunpoint and I choose to give up my money, Aristotle will say it's an unfortunate scenario, but I voluntarily gave up my money because there are other things I could have done.
Right.
I could have refused. I could have run away. I could have tried to, do a roundhouse kick on the person,
Yeah.
I mean, he's not saying any of those things are prudent, but he's saying whenever you have that kind of degree of freedom of movement that's open to you, the action is voluntary, even if your choice is a hard one.
Yeah.
Right. So about the only kind of case he'll come up with where he'll say your behavior is involuntary is if the moving principle is completely outside of you. So if a tornado comes and picks you up from outside the unit here and takes you 15 miles. And and someone says, well, Karen, why did you voluntarily go to, I don't know, South Shore, Chicago? You'll say, I didn't voluntarily go. The tornado took me there. And he'll say, yeah, in that case, the moving principle was the wind. And I think exactly the reason he uses that example of the wind is because the wind moves by definition.
Yeah. Sneaky.
Yeah. But an action is involuntary then whenever it's genuinely compelled, when the moving principle is completely outside of you and you have no control over it whatsoever.
Which is very rare.
Yeah. Or when you're dealing with what I think of as a bizarre set of circumstances that lead you to be ignorant of what's at stake. So he gives the example of where you're dealing with a weapon that is in some sense flawed. You had no way really of knowing that it was a damaged weapon, and there's an accident that occurs. Then he'll say, well, in that case, in a way, the moving principle was outside of you. It was kind of an ignorance that was in the circumstances. So he's not envisioning a circumstance where it's readily foreseeable. That if you leave your child at home playing with matches, it's foreseeable that the unit might be burned down. So you can't then say from Aristotle's perspective, well, I didn't know. I have no sharing the blame here. You do, because it's completely foreseeable that a small child might start a fire, even though you didn't intend that to happen. But if you're dealing with really odd circumstances, unforeseen circumstances, bizarre, weird circumstances, then Aristotle will to some extent let you off the hook. But he's very keen on narrowing the sphere in which we can let ourselves off the hook. And then you ask yourself, why? Why is he being such a stickler on this point? And I think the answer is because we're really only as free as we think we are. If we think we have no degree of freedom of movement, then we won't generate options for ourselves, and we won't have many degrees of freedom. And also, if you want to shape a community where people are kind, just, courageous, you have to have people own their own agency.
Yeah, it's like extreme accountability.
Accountability, yeah. I maybe would say responsibility. We can talk a little bit later about the difference between responsibility and accountability. But so it's very interesting that Aristotle is quite keen on that. And I think it's not so much that he wants to set up a system of praise and blame. He thinks that there are these systems, there need to be these systems to educate children and to run legal systems. But he also thinks that we're only happy if we live a well-organized life, and we're more likely to structure our life in a way that will leave us fulfilled. If we own our agency, if we just say, oh, I'm at the mercy of circumstance, we'll never take charge of our lives.
And it makes sense, because when you think about your decisions in the context that you put out, it does make you think about certain things. Like a good example that I think of in modern day is the Harvey Weinstein situation.
Right.
Like those people around him have to take accountability or responsibility for the situation and the things that occurred. In this context, for sure they would. But I think human nature, like you said, is to kind of, when something good happens, take praise, but if something bad happens, oh, I washed my hands of it. I didn't know this was happening.
Or blame.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I guess the question in a way is, what did people know and what could they reasonably have known if they had exerted themselves to find out? There's a new movie out that I want to see called The Assistant, about a woman who's very low on the totem pole, who has a boss who I think is off stage the entire film, which is also kind of interesting to have just a disembodied voice. But in this case, someone who's very young, someone who's very new, someone who is not being told much, who's having to pick up clues on her own, would, in my view, be in a different position from somebody who's, the right-hand man or right-hand woman of a serial sexual harasser. But still, what could she have known, and what kind of agency did she have available to her? And those questions are actually posed in the movie, is my understanding.
Oh,
so I'm very interested to see
Is this
film.
an indie film, or is it a...
I don't know. I think it's not here in Chicago yet. It was just released, I think, this week or last week. Yeah,
okay, I'll have to take a look. Yeah, I've seen like Bombshell and then some of the morning show about Matt Lauer. Mm-hmm. And again, it's sort of pervasive that people knew it was happening to some degree, whether it was rumor and innuendo or not. Right. Nobody really wanted to dig any deeper. But if you look at it in the context of Nicomachean ethics, you'd have to say, well, I'm voluntarily letting this happen, right? I mean, is that,
Right.
am I applying that in the right way?
Right. I think if you're escorting women up to your
monster's office, yeah.
boss's office or hotel room, and then you see the woman come out disheveled, and crying, you have some responsibility here to ask
Yeah.
some questions about what did I just contribute to? What am I complicit
Yeah.
in? And I don't think all complicity is at the same level. I think there are different degrees of complicity, but I think a lot of what happens in organizations is people see no evil, hear no evil,
Right.
and then
Right.
think, okay, I have
To preserve themselves.
themselves,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Well, so that leads us to a good segue. Let's talk about accountability versus responsibility. That's a topic that you cover in one of your books. And so I probably was using them wrong. So
No, I think we use them. We use them interchangeably, and I started thinking about that. No, maybe we shouldn't. So,
yeah.
what is the difference between accountability and responsibility? Well, there are two different words to start with, right?
Yeah.
And accountability has the notion of you're rendering an account to somebody. So for me, accountability is usually something like a duty to meet standards or to fulfill duties that are imposed from the outside. So, for example, as a professor, I'm accountable for producing a syllabus.
Yeah.
I'm accountable for meeting with students during my stated office hours. I'm accountable for turning in grades. And these are all duties that are imposed upon me by the job description of the university and then by the accrediting board, for example, if you want to push it really far back. But I wouldn't say that a professor is ethical just because she fulfills these minimal externally imposed duties.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm teaching a syllabus and I see it's not working, right?
Yeah,
then
yeah.
I think a responsible professor, if I'm a responsible professor, I think I will define for myself what I need to do in this situation. What does the situation call for? And I will devise for myself a standard. And I will revise the syllabus, for example, or I'll probe with the students and find out what's working and why are certain things not working, and try to get some consensus on how we can make the class better as a group or whatever. So I think responsibility is a kind of fulfillment of your freedom to define yourself. I mean, if you want to think about it a different way, in a certain kind of way, accountability gives you a self already defined, because the legal system is the source of accountability, not me.
Right.
And I don't even consent to that. If I'm born or operating in the United States, I'm already accountable to the U.S. legal system in a lot of ways. If I join a bank or if I join a university, there also are a whole host of rules and duties that I become accountable to, but I have had no role in formulating.
Yeah.
But responsibility seems to me to be something that operates a bit more at the individual level, where I have some freedom to say, whoa, that's not the kind of person I want to be. I think that what I need to do here to be the human being that I want to be, to live a fulfilled life, is to do the following. And Socrates is, for me, always the example of someone who led a really responsible life. So even though he was being told that he legally had to make an arrest that he thought was immoral, and he refused to do it, and even though the state held him to account by having him drink the hemlock, there's a way in which he held himself responsible to his own self-definition.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we remember him. That's the part that's really compelling. And I think that it's an important distinction, because I think a lot of people get into trouble because they abide by the rules of their company. But if the rules are corrupt, or the expectations are thoroughly corrupt, you can be completely accountable and be living a really miserable life.
Yeah, I kept thinking when you were talking about an employee who kind of checks the boxes on the job to be done, but then has really no engagement or, responsibility. And I like the way you frame it, where it's actually giving you more freedom.
Right.
In that way, instead of like something I have to do or should do, it's actually giving you more freedom and to be more self-actualized and live a better life and be more fulfilled.
Right. Yeah, and it gives you, with that freedom comes the possibility of really pursuing substantive goals. Another distinction I draw in my new book on accountability versus responsibility is that accountability is largely kind of a formal operation. here are the rules. The
Yeah.
connection is not necessarily made to a good life or a fulfilled life or a
Yeah.
happy life. While with responsibility, people are oftentimes saying, oh, I have to do X because if I don't, I can never live with myself. Or I want to do Y because I think I'll be a better teacher and the student will learn more if I
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
Y. So you're now with responsibility in a world with more substantive goals that you've given yourself rather than just a world of formal requirements, or in
Yeah.
your language, a world of ticky boxes.
Yeah. I feel like we just cracked the code on life. But, so how many books do you have?
Oh, have I written?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh my goodness.
I
I saw quite a few.
don't know. Maybe I've edited 3 or 4, and I've
Okay.
written maybe 6 or so. Maybe
You're so nonchalant about
well,
that.
maybe 10 in total. Yeah, well, I've been around for a while,
Yeah.
and it's my full-time job being
Yeah,
a
yeah.
professor.
Nice. So you did have a book that was interesting, and I read a little bit of the snippet that I could get online about feminists.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so say a little bit more about that book. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I wrote a book on rethinking feminist ethics. And what I was interested in was the emergence of a new way of thinking about ethics, a way largely driven by female philosophers and female theorists,
Sure.
where the focus was on
Which are there a lot of those? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there are a fair number actually
yeah.
in ethics, and I think there have for a long time been within at least I don't know the French and the German tradition so well, but within the Anglo-American tradition, there have been a number of well-known female ethicists who have done a lot of work on, how should I characterize it? I guess I would say non-rule-based ethics. There are people interested in the phenomenon of caring and trust, and that seems to be a phenomenon that is, if caring is not a virtue, at least is maybe a kind of quasi-virtue. And we have parents who care for their children, and yes, they have a duty to care under the law, but their caring it seems to be something much more spontaneous and self-developed with an affective, underlay here. So I just got interested in understanding alternative ways of thinking about living a good life that didn't turn sort of into algorithmic mechanisms where you sort of say, well, to make the right decision in this case, you isolate your value and then you apply the dominant value and so forth. It just seems to me that's not really the way we make choices, and it's not the way we live our lives. And a lot of what these women were saying was that the traditional male-dominated ethics had been much more focused on rules and principles.
Oh, interesting.
And they were interested in focusing on underlying phenomena. So, for example, a good example, I think it was one that Annette Beyer used. When you think about having a babysitter, or for your kids, or a cat sitter for your cats, I don't think you think, I'm going to outline 25 rules here of what the cat sitter has to do.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to choose the best cat sitter based upon who I think is most likely to adhere to these rules. And it's not like you say to yourself, I'm going to be evaluating the cat sitter's care in terms of the extent to which he or she adhered to these 25 rules. It's more like you asking, does the sitter have good judgment? Do I think I can trust that the sitter's character is such that the cat sitter is going to play with the cat, isn't going to torment the cat, is going to be responsive if the cat injures her paw? Will the cat sitter know that this is a case to take to the vet, or to call Karen about care about it? So I've always been interested in the non-rule-based ethics, where you're asking yourself, what does ethical discernment look like here?
Yeah.
And that's what I think a lot of women philosophers have been focused on in the last 20 or 30 years.
Well, and you mentioned caring and
trust.
Is that because that's a more communal trait, more typically aligned with females, you think?
I think it's because women are often caregivers.
Yeah.
And so if you think about what one of the dominant virtues is in the house, it's caring.
Yeah.
And we tend to understand our relationships with our elderly parents and with our children and or with our pets in terms of caring, not in terms of rule adherence.
Oh gosh, I couldn't even imagine. So how does one become more in tune with their ethics? You mentioned that it is possible, but I keep thinking of like the young person starting out in business, and they are kind of thrown into the wild to some degree. And how do you become an ethical leader going forward?
Yeah, I took a couple of notes on that. You had given me that question in advance. I thought that's a really good question. I guess I think that in the spirit of answering the question in terms of responsibility rather than accountability, I would say I think that there are certain questions we need to ask ourselves. And some of these questions stray into psychology, I think because psychology and ethics are not so firmly distinguished as people might like to think. But I think one of the questions we should ask ourselves are, what do we fear? And what are our anxieties? Because I think a lot of deviant behavior arises when people act out of fear.
Interesting.
Or they're extremely anxious, and those things make them amenable to being manipulated by other people.
Yeah.
Or the fear and anxiety may so cripple people that they really are not even thinking clearly.
And you mean a fear like I won't have a paycheck, or I don't have enough money to pay my bill?
Right, or the boss won't like me and then will fire me, or the boss won't like me and then will give me a 3 on my annual review rather than a 4, or my group won't like me. So I think what a lot of people fear is ostracism.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to be alone in this world. So I can certainly understand that's a really powerful motivation. But if we're not individually aware of where our fear and anxiety buttons are, so to speak, we really are at the mercy of other people and circumstances then. So I think that that's something to understand. I think also we should think about our own self-image. Like, am I the kind of person who wants always to be in control? So then if I answer that question honestly that I am, then I would advocate one should say, well, what are the kinds of problems that might arise out of always wanting to be in control? And you can see right away, well, one can see, I'm not saying anybody will see this, but if you've thought about these kinds of things for a while, you can see there could be ethical issues there. That one could be a micromanager. So basically, one's preventing one's subordinates from ever developing, because one never empowers them to make any decisions, because one's always making that. Oftentimes people who are sort of control freaks also are real screamers in my experience.
So pound the fist on the table.
Yeah. And then, then people don't want to bring bad news to you. So then
or ideas,
right? So you don't hear good ideas and you don't hear bad news. So then your own position becomes kind of vulnerable in a way. I think we should ask, am I a follower or am I an onlooker? There's been a wonderful PBS series, Sanditon. It's a dramatization of Jane Austen's last uncompleted novel. And there are some problems with the dramatization, but one aspect of it that appears to pick on themes that Jane Austen had actually written in her book concerns the character of one of the protagonists, Sidney Parker. And he characterizes himself as an outlier, someone who's been disappointed in love and has kind of withdrawn from the human community. But one of the women who is trying to befriend him says, no, you're not just really an outlier. You're just kind of selfish. You're sort of selfishly disengaged. And so I thought, so here's an interesting point where the person has a self-description, I am an outlier, and is living comfortably with that. But I think we need to challenge those descriptions and say, are those really true or adequate to the situation? And that's why we need to ask ourselves, do we have any friends? And are our friends good friends? Because friends oftentimes are the people who challenge our self-descriptions, in a gentle way, one hopes, and in a loving way, one hopes, but, gives us that kind of challenge. So that too would be a kind of question I think we should ask. Am I an enabler? I think oftentimes people who are enablers think they're doing the right thing.
Right.
But in fact, they may be encouraging kinds of deviance by skating over problems, in the behavior of those whom they're enabling. I was talking to my sister, who's an art teacher, and she had just been at an art camp, and it was quite competitive to get into this art camp. And the city that was running it wanted to sort of restrict admission so that it would be a small group of people kids who could get individualized attention. And also they wanted a variety of kids, and maybe also some kids who had challenges in the home life and who would benefit from having some time away in a a supportive environment doing
Yeah.
art with other adults. And she was volunteering in this classroom. And since she herself is a former teacher, she has a pretty keen eye. And she said there was a young boy who simply was refusing to do the work. He was sort of in the corner, throwing a temper tantrum.
Yeah.
And one of the teachers came over and said, "Oh, poor you. Would you like to play, or is there anything else you can do?" But the teacher came over and said, "Well, where are you, Billy or Johnny? Where are
Yeah.
you on this 3-point perspective? And why aren't you doing it? And I
Yeah.
want to see you doing it." And I thought, that the first response was an enabling response
Yeah.
and was going to set this kid up to
get out of it
to get
somehow,
out of it,
yeah.
or to potentially form a
Yeah.
habit of continually throwing tantrums whenever he was asked to do something that he
Yeah.
didn't want to do. But also there was the reality that this kid had taken a slot, from some other
Somebody-
child
yeah.
who would have been there and who would have been happy to be doing the work.
Yeah.
So
I keep thinking of like the CEO who has the chief of staff who does like kind of the handiwork for the CEO, and he or she thinks they're doing it for the better of the company, and and they're the enabler in the enabler position. Yeah.
Right. So there's a good paper to be written. I don't know
Yeah.
if I'll write it, but on the role of enabling in
Yeah.
corporate deviance, and I suspect there's a fair amount of that goes on. Where again, people can tell themselves they're doing the right thing. Oh, I'm just being attentive
Yeah.
to the child who's throwing a temper
Right.
tantrum. But attentive is one of those loaded words.
Yeah.
There's kind of good attention and there's bad
Yeah.
attention, and what kind of attention am I developing? I think another question that we can ask ourselves that may help prime us to have greater appropriate ethical sensitivity is to ask ourselves, what is our attitude towards status or material goods? I think a lot of people also get involved in deviance because they care a lot about status. When I was on the trading floor at the bank, I knew a lot of very decent people. I thought though that there were some people who were quite alienated from their work. I think they had liked trading, but they had gotten bored with it after 10 or 15 years. But they had bought the big house in the suburb, and now they're really locked into staying with the job.
Yeah.
And we know from some of the white collar criminal literature that two of the leading predictors of deviance are what your immediate boss does and tolerates,
Yeah.
and then the extent to which you're alienated from your job. So people who really don't like their job are oftentimes inclined to act out or to rationalize
And they justify
doing
it,
things
yeah.
and justify things by saying the company owes me, the boss owes
Yeah.
me, I've got this crummy job, or I'm being asked to do X,
Yeah.
Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah.
I'm
So
picturing the fraud triangle as you're talking. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, I think your audience here can play it out, but you can see how, you really need to ask yourself about the extent to which you're attached to status and monetary things. Of course, I'm not saying that it's not nice having a warm apartment, and nice clothes, but I am saying that you want to have what I call walk away money. There are less polite words for this phrase, but a walk away fund, so that if you begin to feel really uncomfortable, you're less likely to feel trapped, and you're more likely to have some viable options.
Yeah.
If you have given yourself a stash of $10,000 or something where you can go away, quit the job, and find other work.
Yeah, because if you're trapped, it leads you back to that fear, your first question around fear
Right.
and why are you acting and how are you acting? And then when you're saying status and that, I kept thinking of social media.
Yeah.
And the pressures there, and people going hiking just to take the picture that they're out hiking. They're not actually hiking.
Yeah.
It's like
And they're not
unbelievable.
enjoying hiking, right.
Yeah, just to show that they're at some beautiful scenic place. But yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't know so much about that because I'm not really on social media much.
Yeah,
And
which doesn't surprise me.
yeah, but I do think that the pressures there are clearly real.
Yeah.
And very and potentially quite dangerous and damaging for young people. And if people don't get through their high school years with some sense of self intact and some owning of their own agency, so they can say, oh, finally, I'm just going to leave social media. I don't need to
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
be hyper-responsive to what
Right.
these other people are saying. Then I think we'll be in a really serious position. I think you can see we're already in a difficult place with, I think teen suicides are quite high, is my understanding.
Yeah. And as much as you value the praise, you can't, you can't value the praise as much, because then when the negative comes, you're going to value the negative as much as, you value the praise. Yeah. So it's a slippery slope.
Right. And also just kind of logic. Why do I care if I have 1,000 likes from people whose judgment I don't respect, or whose judgment
Johnny
is not
Pants
well
96.
formed?
I don't care what. Right.
Right. I mean, actually, Aristotle has quite an interesting discussion about why honor cannot be the final good. He thinks it's better to be a person who cares about honor, because then one will be drawn towards the beautiful and the noble act. But he also says, even then, the person wants to be honored by the right people at the right time in the right way. If I'm a basketball player and Michael Jordan or James LeBron says, "Oh, that was a really good play," I'm going to value that praise because I know it comes from somebody who knows, what he's seeing. But if Joe Schmo,
who says in their parents' basement, in their underwear,
says, "Oh, that was a great layup," or "That was a not good layup," why should I care?
Yeah. Good. Well, you have a lot going on. You have a book in the works on ethical dilemmas.
Right.
Okay, great. So what else is next then for 2020 for you? Not that that's not enough, but
yeah, that's probably going to be enough. We are looking at doing some programming at the Institute on possible threats to the election, again, going into the election cycle.
Yeah.
And possibly the role of technology and AI or outside parties and so forth. So that's kind of fluid, but is in the
That's a great topic.
And we also are running a competition for college students and high school students, an ethics competition.
I think I just got the email on that today.
Yeah. So we're excited about that. That's a lot of work, but we're really happy that we've got high school students involved for the first time. So that will be a chance for them to meet peers with similar interests and
just get
exercise
that
their
critical
brain cells
thinking skills.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, great. This was phenomenal. I appreciate all of your time and wisdom on this topic. It's fascinating.
You're so kind. You were a great student. I can tell your interest in ethics it's quite genuine. It shines through. So I wish you luck in all of your interviews with these victors.
It's been great.
Women who've owned their agency.
Yeah.
Women who've owned their agency.
Yeah, this is a totally different take, so I love it. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.